Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Barack Obama. You probably know a few interesting tidbits on each of these notable former presidents. Maybe you learned about them in history class or watched a documentary on their achievements and failures. But what about lesser-known presidents like Warren G. Harding or Calvin Coolidge? While they may not have a prominent historical narrative today, they all had a big impact on American policy and society.
When I began to do a little bit more research on Warren G. Harding, he had many similarities with the last president I covered, namely Donald Trump. Warren G. Harding was the first president to campaign on the slogan, more than a notion, on the slogan of America First. Warren G. Harding inherited a difficult economy, and he revived the economy through tax cuts, similar to what Donald Trump did 100 years later. Both presidents had a focus on immigration and reducing immigration from outside the United States. So the two presidents had a lot of similarities.
That's Ronald Gruner, the author of We the Presidents: How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century. Gruner's book dives into each of the presidents between 1921 and 2021. The collection starts with the 29th president, Warren G. Harding, who led the country from 1921 to 1923. Unfortunately, he died from a heart attack halfway into his presidency. He's often ranked by historians as one of the worst presidents ever. But Gruner argues the opposite, highlighting his many contributions to modern immigration and economic policy.
He also was the grandfather of supply-side economics, an economic philosophy that's propagated over the last 100 years, and that was really revived and popularized by Ronald Reagan during the Reagan economic revolution. He did that through his cabinet secretary, Andrew Mellon, who developed the notion that reducing taxes often can increase tax revenues because if people are overtaxed, they avoid tending to pay. Andrew Mellon called that scientific taxation. Today we call it supply-side economics. Another thing that Harding did was he brought in Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover is painted with a rather negative brush because of his presidency during the Depression. But during the 1920s, he was considered the best commerce secretary the nation had ever had and pioneered many, many things to encourage business.
And Harding wasn't just focused on commerce. During the early 20th century, he fought hard for equality and civil rights for all, especially in the deeply divided South.
He was the first sitting president to go to the Deep South, Birmingham, Alabama specifically, with a strong message of racial equality, simply saying, we cannot truly be America and a democracy if we don't respect all races and genders and religions as equal. And he took that message to the Deep South, to a very divided crowd, divided, segregated by whites and blacks. I think there were close to tens of thousands of people there. And it was a brave thing to do at the time.
But despite his accomplishments, a couple of large scandals ultimately overshadowed his brief presidency. Gruner says this is why many historians today paint Harding in a negative light.
After he died, news or information about scandals and fraud in his administration came out, namely the Teapot Dome scandal, in which his Interior Secretary took bribes to give contracts to oil companies. And 5 years after he died, a book was written by the mother of his daughter, writing about the fact that his daughter was conceived when he was a senator, which, of course, painted a negative aspect to his reputation many years after he died, which stayed with him for many years.
Harding is not the only one who faced these troubles. In fact, many presidents dealt with scandals that affected their legacy in office. Richard Nixon, for instance, made incredible progress on environmental policy during his years in office, but is rarely remembered for this contribution.
The environment was filthy in the 50s and 60s. The air was filthy. You had acid rain decomposing buildings and statues, making people were dying occasionally in the hundreds when you had a low depression over a city. The rivers were filthy, caught fire. The Cuyahoga caught fire a number of times in Pittsburgh or in Pennsylvania. So he put in the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. He instituted OSHA because people were dying at a higher rate in industry than they were in Vietnam in the 1960s. And also automobile safety. And Richard Nixon did all that, to his credit. It's not recognized now. He was so active in putting in regulations for the environment. The economist Milt Friedman, who was a kind of a free market economist, called Nixon the most socialist president of the 20th century, which to him was a denigration, but actually showed how active Nixon was promoting the environment.
Today, many people hear the name Nixon and instantly think of the Watergate scandal. The same goes for Bill Clinton, who will forever be connected to his affair with Monica Lewinsky. These scandals rocked the nation and left a lasting stain on their time in office. Another common pitfall for presidents stems from the big-picture decisions that impact the nation for many years to come. All too often, hindsight is 20/20. And practically every former president has made some hard choices that not everyone agrees with.
Harry Truman, for example, basically made a lot of hard decisions that made him the most unpopular president leaving the presidency of any time. Yet over the years, he's come to be respected for the difficult decisions that he actually made. So courage is very important. The other thing I personally give a great deal of credit to is character. I mean, people sometimes say, well, I don't like so-and-so, or I don't care for the individual, but I like his policies. Well, I tend to disagree with it. I really think the first thing we as Americans should look for is character, because that ultimately comes out and affects how decisions are made down the road. So character is something we don't see in our presidents, but I think is very, very important.
Qualities like character, leadership, and resilience are just some of the traits that factor into a politician becoming a commander-in-chief. Another key part is the strategy behind each presidential campaign, which builds on past successful campaigns. Take slogans, for instance.
The greatest similarity over the last 100 years goes back to our friend Warren G. Harding. He had two campaign slogans, was America First and Return to Normality is the phrase he used, return to normality. In the early 1920s, the United States was recovering from World War I, the Spanish flu of 1918, and progressive politics very aggressively pursued for 20 years, starting with Teddy Roosevelt. So that was his focus. In 1980, Ronald Reagan campaigned on Let's Make America Great Again, which is essentially the same idea as America First and a return to normality. Reagan was looking back at an earlier time to return America to, just as Harding was. And then, of course, we all know Donald Trump ran on America First and Make America Great, which was just an adoption of Reagan's campaign phrase of Let's Make America Great Again. He just dropped the let's.
On top of slogans, another similarity is the strategy behind which issues to focus on during the lead-up to the election.
Every president has taken advantage of the weaknesses and the problems in the prior presidency he is running against. Nixon did that very effectively when he basically campaigned on law and order, something we hear today after the race riots and the riots against the Vietnam War in the mid to late 1960s. And to some extent, that divided the nation as we see today. The thing that's changing so rapidly today is that much of that campaigning is so divisive, it's dividing the country into two parts, blue and red.
Over the last 20 to 30 years, Gruner says that this partisan division during campaigning has only further separated Americans based on beliefs. Political campaigning will always be a constant, but this heated animosity between voters has larger implications on democracy and unity. To find out more about the history of U.S. presidents and our guest Ronald Gruner, visit viewpointsradio.org. This segment originally aired in February 2022 and was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.